Hello and welcome to episode 25 of the 1001 Movies podcast. This time I will be talking about John Sturges' 1963 action movie, The Great Escape.
Gentlemen, no doubt you've heard the immortal words of our new commandant. Devote your energies to things other than escape and sit out the war as comfortably as possible. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig. Now, even a superficial look at the compound shows us that huts 104 and 5 are closest to the woods. The first tunnel goes out from 105, directly east under the Vorlager, the Cooler, and the Wire.
But that's over 300 feet, Roger.
Did you make a survey, Dennis?
Only a temporary one, sir. I make it just over 335 feet.
Let me know when you've got an exact one, will you? This time we'll dig straight down 30 feet before we go horizontal. That'll rule out any question of sound detection or probing.
All right, Roger, but did you say the first tunnel?
I did. There'll be 3. We'll call them Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom, as I said, goes out directly east from 104. Dick goes north from the kitchen, and Harry goes out parallel to Tom from 105. If the goons find one, we'll move into the other.
How many men do you plan to take out, Roger?
250. There'll be no half measures this time, gentlemen. There'll be identification papers and documents for everyone. And Griff, we'll need outfits for the lot.
There's a special subgenre of films that existed once upon a time. It included such movies as Stalag 17, The Bridge Over the River Kwai, The Colditz Story, and Grand Illusion. They have a special niche in cinema history, away from traditional prison stories, because they involve innocent men who are not exactly unjustly incarcerated, but are thrown behind bars as a matter of procedure, per the Geneva Convention. In many of them, such as Stalag 17 and Grand Illusion, the wardens and guards themselves are innocent men, often respected and befriended by their prisoners, although both the Germans and the Allied troops know that the imperative of every imprisoned soldier is not unlike that of a hamster in a cage, to escape at all costs. Perhaps because of films like The Deer Hunter and Platoon, or perhaps because the days of enforcing the Geneva Convention are behind us, the POW film seems to be a thing of the past. But the granddaddy of them all is The Great Escape, with its Technicolor widescreen richness, a running time of almost 3 hours, and a cast of a dozen or so now famous actors. As the film opened with a jaunty, cheerful score and the names of James Gardner, Steve McQueen, Richard Attenborough, James Coburn, and Charles Bronson graced the screen, I couldn't help but wonder how manly and patriotic it was pulling itself off as. The Great Escape is not about the toils of POW life. It's not even really about the quest to escape back home, but it's about the duty of the Allied troops to throw a monkey wrench into Germany's control over much of Europe. The film states it's based on a true story, and I admittedly took this with a grain of salt. What really happened in German prison camp Stalag Luft 3, and yes, spoilers follow, is that a team of prisoners headed by South African pilot Roger Bushell schemed to escape the camp via one of 3 tunnels, humorously named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Their mission was a resounding success, and 76 men succeeded in escaping, 73 of which were later caught, and 50 of those, in a blatant disregard to the Geneva Convention, were executed by the Gestapo. Only 3 of the men, a Dutchman and 2 Norwegians, escaped with their lives. This true story is almost an exact synopsis of what happens in the film, and when one steps back to see what these guys really did to escape, it is breathtaking. Of course, the filmmakers took their creative liberties here and there, but more on that in a minute. The unbelievable occurrences that took place at Stalag Luft 3 were chronicled in a book by prisoner Paul Brickhill entitled, of course, The Great Escape. Published in 1950, the book immediately caught the attention of director John Sturges, who would eventually make over 40 films such as 1950's Bad Day at Black Rock and 1960's The Magnificent Seven. Sturges had a penchant for directing films with an ensemble male cast, and he thought The Great Escape was just up his alley. MGM, with whom he was under contract with at the time, thought otherwise, and the project was shelved until Sturges made The Magnificent Seven, which instilled the studio's trust in him to make a project of his own. Sturges and his crew didn't jump through hoops to make sure just the story was true to life. They also wanted to make sure the sets looked like the real thing. They enlisted the help of Canadian Wally Floody, who actually helped to construct the tunnels in the real Stalag Luft 3 as a technical advisor, ensuring that the depiction of the tunnels was as accurate as possible. The scene in which Willie is barely crushed as the tunnel collapses is a depiction of what actually happened to Floody. Actor Charles Bronson, who had dug tunnels for coal miners, and Donald Pleasance, who had himself been a POW, lent their voices to the technical side of the production as well. The producers even found themselves filming at a studio just outside Munich after a small disagreement with the Screen Actors Guild precluded them from making the movie in California. As I mentioned, the filmmakers did take their liberties with the film. The only character who arguably existed is Roger Bartlett, played by Richard Attenborough. He was based on the aforementioned Roger Bushnell, who had made several previous attempts to escape from other prisoners. Why they didn't just use his real name is unknown to me. The characters played by many of the leads were not actual people, but amalgamations of different men. There was not just one scrounger, for instance, but many. The only task allotted to a single individual was that of the forger, and he didn't really go blind like Donald Pleasance does in the film. Also, the Germans transferred all of the Americans out of the camp before they escaped. This would mean, of course, that James Garner and Steve McQueen would have to be ejected before the film's suspenseful final act, and this, of course, would be box office suicide. The 50 men executed by the Gestapo were not killed in a single mass shooting, but they were slowly marched out of their holding cells and executed one by one over a series of days. Perhaps for reasons of brevity, this was left out of the film, as was the manhunt that later ensued for the men that were responsible for the massacre. By 1945, all but one of them were found and hanged for war crimes. Finally, the resigned contentedness enjoyed by the surviving prisoners at the end of the film was pure fiction. In actuality, there was not a single drop of pride left in the men by the time their debacle was over, given that so many of them were killed. This was despite the fact that the actual camp housed about 10,000 men, although it only seems like a few hundred in the film. Before its release, the actual survivors of the event were given a private screening of The Great Escape. They loved the film. The liberties that were taken outweighed the message and feelings that the story conveyed. It was critically acclaimed and a success at the box office, and earned an Oscar nomination for editor Ferris Webster. What did I think of it? I saw this the first time when I was, 12 years old. At the time, it just had too much talking and was too long for me. Watching it now, almost 30 years later, I fell in love with it. It is the epitome of the 1960s Hollywood blockbuster, before the term blockbuster was even coined, not unlike Mutiny on the Bounty some 30 years before it. Most of the main cast are acting legends in 2015, and not a single one of them fails to impress, with the small exception of James Coburn's Australian accent. The first two-thirds of the film, which are literally just people talking in rooms about how they'll escape, somehow doesn't slow anything down because the characters are so rich and likable. By the final third of the film, I was totally invested in these guys getting out of there. Their being recaptured was not a total defeat. After all, they did it primarily for the sake of frustrating the Germans, but the execution of the 50 men is a crushing blow. In retrospect, the lighthearted ending, in which Steve McQueen is sent once again to the cooler with his favorite baseball mitt, seems just a tad bit disrespectful. But this is really overshadowed by everything wonderful there is to be had here. At the risk of labeling, it truly is a quote-unquote guy movie, and a damn good one at that. That's all I have to say about The Great Escape. Tune in next time when I talk about the 1964 Soviet Union film Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, directed by Sergei Parajanov. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc, and look for the podcast on Facebook. Until next time, happy viewing.